Kia ora koutou, welcome to our webinar on the draft local alcohol policy. For those that have just arrived, my name is Claire Fletcher. I am your host today. A bit of an agenda before we get started. First, I'm going to introduce to you our speakers today and let you know how you can participate during the session. Then I'll hand over to our presenters who will run you through an overview of the local alcohol policies and how they work, the policies that we are proposing in our draft, and how feedback has shaped them over the last few months. Then there'll be plenty of time to answer the questions that you may have as well after we've discussed what those policies are. So who you can see. Today you're going to be hearing from myself and Thomas Lee, who'll turn on his camera. Cool. Thank you, Thomas. And in addition, we also have Philip Henderson, Amy Martin and Ron Lem, who are our subject matter experts listening in and available to answer questions today as well. And behind the scenes, we also have Aviva, who is helping us run the webinar and capture your questions. Thank you to those that have already provided some prior to the meeting, to the webinar. Your mics and cameras have been switched off so that we can keep the session moving, but you can ask questions in the Microsoft Teams Q&A, which is located in the top bar menu as a speech bubble with a question mark. If you're not able to use that, you can also email your questions through to letstalk@ccc.govt.nz. Sorry. Let's try that again. Let's talk at ccc.govt.nz. That's the correct email address. I should know that. If you're hard of hearing or you're experiencing sound issues, you can also turn on live captions. Just click on the small three dots above More on your screen at the top of the screen, and then click on Turn on Live Captions, which is 2/3 of the way down the list that will appear. One last thing from me around how the webinar will operate. Hopefully the banner came up and let you know that this session is being recorded. The recording will be shared on our YouTube channel in the next few days, and you'll receive a link via email and information on how to access it, with a copy of the PowerPoint slides that we used today and a copy of all the questions and answers that we provide as well. We're now going to start the presentation, which starts with me talking. So here we go. So a local alcohol policy's scope is that it sets out rules and conditions about how alcohol is sold and supplied, and its scope only focuses on alcohol licensing. The purpose is to support the objectives of the Sale and Supply of Alcohol Act, which is that the sale and supply of alcohol is undertaken in a safely and responsibly, and that alcohol-related harm is minimised. Now, under a local alcohol policy, the District Licensing Committee continues to consider alcohol licence applications on a case-by-case basis, but must consider the local alcohol policy in force when making decisions about licensing. One of the benefits of a local alcohol policy is that industry and the District Licensing Committee have told us that it can provide more certainty about licensing decisions and consistency. So how do they work? Well, if a local alcohol policy is in place, the district licensing, who is responsible for considering those licensing applications, must have regard to it when making their decisions on licenses. They're allowed to refuse a license in the application if the application is inconsistent with a local alcohol policy. Now, if there is a license application where the applicant or applying the local alcohol policy doesn't seem appropriate, the district licensing does still have discretion to make a decision inconsistent with that policy. This is useful when it's hard for a local alcohol policy to accommodate absolutely every possible solution that might arise. However, there is an expectation that the local alcohol policy should always be considered in licence applications and applied appropriately by the District Licensing Committee. Now, generally for licence applicants, the community and the District Licensing Committee, the local alcohol policy can provide greater clarity around licensing decisions because there are non-policies in place that the District Licensing Committee will apply. So the next slide here you can see is the timeline, which shows where we are in the process, the work that we've done so far, and the next milestones. Now you can see here that Council first directed staff to commence work on a local alcohol policy in June 2024, last year. And we've undertaken a significant amount of research, stakeholder engagement, and analysis of data, testing options, and now have drafted a policy. We're currently at the special consultative process stage, which you can see there marked in yellow, which includes opportunity for submitters and yourselves to submit your thoughts on the draft policy and speak to Council about your feedback as well. It is the final opportunity for the community to provide feedback into the process prior to a decision being made on whether to adopt one. And that adoption or that final decision being made by councillors, we expect to happen in late July or August. The options we are consulting on now have been informed by both the research report, which was prepared in 2024 and available on the consultation page at letstalk.ccc.govt, and early community engagement, which happened earlier this year. Now, the research report included feedback from the community last year, as well as a range of data and information from statutory consultees and other resources or sources. The early engagement that we did earlier this year was based on issues identified through that research and looked at what other councils' local alcohol policies had set up. And this led us to test 6 options, which you can see on the screen here. Reducing the closing hours of off licenses, placing a temporary freeze on new licenses in high deprivation areas, restricting licensed premises from being located close to sensitive sites, reducing trading hours for on licenses in suburban areas, and consideration of an introduction of a one-way door policy or restriction. We also asked for feedback on other measures and mechanisms that we could potentially look at as a council to help reduce alcohol-related harm, whether that be within a local alcohol policy or otherwise. Now, the results of that engagement, it ran from February until mid-March, and we received over 3,400 pieces of feedback or people providing feedback, which included a number of organisations, licence holders, community boards and community groups. There was over 16,000 views of the website that looked at these options to consider, and that feedback that we received was fairly split across the city when we look at where participants were from. This has also helped us narrow down the proposed policies that we're now going to talk to. I'm now going to hand over to Thomas, who's going to walk you through the proposed policies that we have included in the draft local alcohol policy and how community feedback has helped shape them. A reminder that if you've got questions throughout the presentation, please pop them into the Q&A chat on the right hand of your screen if you've clicked on the Q&A button. We've got Aviva and myself behind the scenes looking at those questions as they come through. If you can't use the Q&A chat, please do send them through to the email at letstalk@ccc.govt.nz. Thomas, over to you. Take it away.
Great, thanks, Claire. So what is presented here is our proposed draft local alcohol policy that's out for consultation, which, as Claire said, has been developed based on the responses to the recent engagement, but also we haven't forgotten the data and the research and the stakeholder feedback that happened prior to that stage as well. Now, when developing this draft local alcohol policy, we kept some clear considerations in mind for our analysis. These were that the policy meets the objectives of the Act, which is about the safe and responsible sale, supply and consumption of alcohol, and to minimise the harm caused by excessive or inappropriate consumption of alcohol. Proportionality, so that the policy response is providing a balanced and proportionate response to alcohol-related harm in the community. And practicality, that the policy options are feasible, not too complex, and can be understood and implemented. So overall, we have aimed to produce a draft local alcohol policy that reasonably reflects the community's views while providing a balanced and proportionate response to alcohol-related harm in the community. It's important to point out then that when balancing these considerations, there isn't any perfect policy. So by that I mean there isn't one policy that will resolve all alcohol-related harm. There isn't one option that doesn't have trade-offs. The policy does respond to what the community has told us, but often the community's preferences can't apply perfectly in every case. So we've tested a range of ways to apply the policies, and we recognise that there are pros and cons to each of these options. But what we have tried to do is reflect the community's views and to take a pragmatic approach. So I will now talk through each of the proposed policies and how they would work. This is policy 1, which is a policy to reduce trading hours for off licenses to 9 p.m. So this policy aims to reduce alcohol-related harm by restricting the accessibility of alcohol that can be purchased at night for consumption in unsupervised drinking environments, often when people may have already been drinking. So this policy would apply to all off licenses. So this includes supermarkets, bottle stores, convenience and small grocery stores, and other venues that provide alcohol to take away off-site. The policy would change the hours from the current possible default of 11 p.m. down to 9 p.m. So the focus on reducing hours at night time is in response to data that shows that most alcohol-related harm occurs at night time or in the early hours. And the policy would apply across both Christchurch City and Banks Peninsula and would come into force no earlier than 3 months after the final LAP is notified publicly. Our early engagement on this option found some community support for this option. So nearly 53% of people supported this policy, and there was a clear split of support before and after 9 p.m. So roughly half the people thought 9 p.m. or earlier, which should be the time that off licenses should close, and half thought after 9 p.m. We're proposing 9 p.m. as the closing time, which is based on the results of this engagement, and also because we had support from our statutory consultees, so that's New Zealand Police, Te Whatu Ora, Health New Zealand, and licensing inspectors for 9 p.m. It's a relatively simple and straightforward policy to apply, but there are some risks that relate to the potential impacts on businesses. So that means there will be reduced trading hours that could impact the revenue for off licenses, and also there'd be an impact for supermarkets that are open later than 9 p.m. Policy 2 is a freeze on new off licenses in high deprivation areas. So this policy aims to minimise alcohol-related harm in high deprivation communities by halting the further proliferation and concentration of off licenses servicing these communities. This policy responds to one of the issues raised through our research, which is that people living in communities with higher levels of deprivation are disproportionately affected by alcohol-related harm. So essentially, this policy stops making access to alcohol easier. This policy would apply to all new off licenses. However, an applicant can apply for an exemption if they can show in the application that the primary purpose of their business is not the sale and supply of alcohol. So this would still allow for businesses to continue to enter into and invest in areas of high deprivation, who may sell alcohol as part of their wider business, but when selling alcohol is not the primary purpose of their business, for example, a gift shop or a supermarket. Under this policy, an existing licensed premises can renew their alcohol license, and an existing licensed premise can change ownership and continue operating. The areas where this policy would apply are those measured as deprivation levels 8 to 10 using the New Zealand Index of Socioeconomic Deprivation, and we'll show you these areas on a map in one moment. Early engagement on this option found there was quite strong community support for this option. So overall, 61% of people supported this policy idea, which included 41% of people who strongly agreed with it. We had a clear signal from the community about which licenses the policy should apply to. Off licenses were the most chosen response for this policy to apply to, with 68% of people choosing bottle stores, 52% small grocery stores, and 47% specialty stores. In terms of other alcohol places, 40% of people chose supermarkets, and there was less support for this policy applying to on licenses. 38% of people thought it should apply to taverns, only 24% for cafes and 18% for restaurants. The key risks of this is the impact on businesses. And so this would restrict the ability for off-license operators to invest in new business endeavours in these areas, which then gives a competitive advantage to retailers who are already operating. We note that for this option, supermarkets are treated differently to other off-licenses. This is because there was less public support to include them in the policy, and we also don't want to stop them from opening up new stores in areas that want or need them, recognising that they do also sell many other things that the community does value. So here is a map of the district with deprivation levels 8 to 10 in red across the city. So it's in these areas that the policy would apply. That is, there will be a freeze on new off-licences in these areas. The District Licensing Committee will consider these maps when assessing a licence application. These areas would remain in place until the LAP is reviewed, which would happen within 6 years. And at that stage, the council can review the impact of the policy and also consider whether updating these areas is necessary. It is important to remember that these areas do already have off-licences and other places to purchase alcohol within them, and these will remain under this policy. So the policy just freezes new off-licences in these areas. So when looking at these maps to apply this policy, a natural questions that get raised are, what about if someone opens up across the road from one of these areas, or what about the small areas of white next to or in between the areas of red? And so to try and make this policy adequately flexible and practical, we've also included a clause within our local alcohol policy to state that in the areas not covered in red, the presumption of a freeze does not apply. However, the DLC, the Licensing Committee, may consider whether issuing a licence would, in its opinion, contribute to the further concentration of off-licence premises that service these high deprivation areas. Policy 3. This would restrict new bottle stores from locating near sensitive sites. So this policy aims to respond to community preferences. The community has previously told us that they would like more say on alcohol licensing, and we've asked the community about this policy idea twice and had a strong response both times. The policy aims to reduce alcohol-related harm by minimising exposure to alcohol among possibly vulnerable populations. So this policy would apply to all new bottle stores and would restrict them from locating near addiction and rehabilitation facilities, primary schools and secondary schools. So these are the sites that the community considered sensitive and that a practical rule can apply. In Christchurch, not including the central city, a distance of 200 metres would be applied to the sensitive sites. In the Banks Peninsula, a smaller distance would apply of 50 metres for both addiction and rehabilitation facilities and schools, to account for the fact that the towns and settlements in the Banks Peninsula are much smaller. And inside the central city, smaller distances would also apply. So a distance of 100 metres would apply for addiction and rehabilitation facilities in the central city and 50 metres for schools. And it would not apply to the city centre zone at all as the zone defined in the district plan. So the different settings for the central city reflect that the central city has many different types of sites within close proximity to each other compared to the rest of the district, and the role that the city centre zone plays as a destination for entertainment and tourism. So some restrictions do remain in place, however, to also acknowledge that there is still some risk to parts of the population in the central city. Under this policy, existing licensed premises can renew their alcohol licence, and a licensed premises can change ownership and continue operating. An applicant can apply for an exemption to this policy if they can show that they have engaged with the affected community and can demonstrate in their application that they can manage the premises in a way that addresses any concerns. And I have some maps to share with you in a moment to help explain this policy. Before that, though, our early engagement on this option found strong community support for this option. So overall, Nearly 68% of people agreed with this policy, which was the most supported of the policies that we engaged the community about. And this also included 41% of people who strongly agreed with this policy idea. The community gave us a clear signal about which sites, licenses and distances should apply for this policy. And an important impact of this policy is that it shifts the onus from the community having to argue that alcohol harm is possible in an application to the applicant having to demonstrate that harm can be mitigated. The key risks, again, for this policy relate to the potential impacts on businesses. So it does restrict where some new businesses can be located, and there may be, for the exemption process, some resource required. There was community support on this policy for unlicensed venues as well, such as taverns, bars and nightclubs to be included in the restriction, and this was recommended to councillors, but on debate they voted to remove the unlicensed venues from this restriction. So on this slide is a map of how the policy would apply in Christchurch today. So the areas that are in the teal colour are the applicable distance from each sensitive site in the city. And a reminder again that these areas may already have licensed premises within them, and these will remain under the policy. It's just that the policy restricts new bottle stores in these areas. This is a close-up of how the policy would apply to the central city. You can see the smaller distances applied to the sensitive sites, and you can see the city's centre zone there in maroon, to which the policy would not apply. And this is the map of how it would apply to the settlements in the Banks Peninsula with that smaller 50-metre zone as well. So this map shows the spatial extent of both policies 2 and 3 together across Christchurch. And these are the areas that would have some sort of restriction applied to some types of new licenses. So you can sort of see the impacts of the policies across the city there. As Claire mentioned earlier, there were other options that we consulted, that we engaged on, that we've opted not to progress. So option D there is reducing trading hours for on licenses in suburban areas. This was the least supported of the options that we engaged on, so just under half of people agreed with this option. And what we initially suggested for the engagement was setting a blanket time for on licenses in suburban areas to close. But what we found from the community views was that people view different types of on licenses quite differently. So, for example, a restaurant is quite different to how people view a nightclub, which is different than a cafe or a tavern. So we could then apply the policy in a blanket way, but that wouldn't really reflect people's views, or we could apply it how they want with different times applying to different venues. But we think that this would add some level of complexity. So both slightly miss the mark in different ways, and the District Licensing Committee can already apply different hours for different venues, and so we thought that was, on balance, retaining the status quo seems appropriate on that one. And finally, for the one-way door policy, so this policy had some community support, and there was a strong preference of those who did support the policy for a one-way door policy at 1 a.m. So a one-way door policy is a relatively straightforward policy to implement. However, we thought that applying a 1 a.m. one-way door policy could have unintended consequences, so such as people leaving supervised venues early and then continuing to drink in unsupervised environments. Feedback from stakeholders also suggested that a 1 a.m. policy would have a negative impact on the city's hospitality industry and nightlife, as many entertainment venues, taverns and nightclubs in the central city rely on revenue at these times, and a blanket one-way door policy could impact the city's vibrancy at night time. Again, this policy, the District's Licensing Committee can already apply a one-way door policy to venues on a case-by-case basis without a local alcohol policy in place. So rather than applying a blanket policy on this, we again think it's appropriate to stick with the status quo in that instance. So that brings me to the end of the presentation slides, and I'll now hand back to Claire so that we can answer some of your questions.
Thanks, Thomas. Appreciate that. Now, prior to the webinar, we did receive some questions from you, and so the team's going to answer them now, and then we'll move through to the questions that have been posted in the Q&A. If you have any further questions after what you've just heard from Thomas and myself, please do put them in the Q&A chat as well, or flick them through on email. So Thomas, if you can turn your camera on, I'm going to stop presenting and then move to the questions. We've got a few. So one of the first questions that came through was asking for clearer maps on the the freeze areas and the sensitive sites areas showing clearer boundaries. Currently, there are several maps on the consultation site that does show quadrants of north, south, east, west of the freeze zones. And in the next couple of days, we're going to put up a similar mapping for the sensitive sites rather than just the district-wide map. Now, if you've got a particular premise that you're interested to understand what the impact of policy 2 and 3 may be on it, please email that location through to us, and the team will be able to look at some internal mapping to share with you what would the impact be on that premise to help you with you formulating your submissions. The next question we've got is Thomas, I'm going to ask you to answer it. It's, will you be reviewing licenses that do not meet the new policy criteria if adopted for 2025?
Yeah, thanks, Claire. Yes, so the ability of existing licence holders to renew their licences is not impacted by the local alcohol policy. So the policy for the 9 p.m. closing applies to all off licences, but the other policies regarding the areas of high deprivation and sensitive sites, the local alcohol policy only applies to licences, or these policies only apply for licences for new premises. And as always, the decision to renew a licence is with the District Licensing Committee, who have the discretion to grant or refuse to issue a licence.
And another question we have there, what about alcohol sales and deliveries to people to their door? I don't see it covered in the policies.
Yes, so this has come up several times in our engagements, and we are aware of the concerns about the ability of people to buy alcohol on demand and online. There are some complicating factors which mean it's not a straightforward thing to deal with for councils, including our council, to regulate the remote and online sales of alcohol. For example, like a licence can be issued in one district, and that's where the transaction of an alcohol sale takes place, but the delivery could be in another district. Also, remote sellers who hold a licence under Section 40 of the Sale and Supply of Alcohol Act are not impacted by local alcohol policies. So there's a few sort of grey areas in regards to those sorts of alcohol sales. So overall, our position is that, and this position reflects also the views of many of the stakeholders that we've engaged with to date, which is that issues regarding the remote sale of alcohol are probably best addressed through central government regulation, so such as amending the Sale and Supply of Alcohol Act, rather than through our council's local alcohol policy.
Thanks, Tom. Thank you, Tom. We've got another one. Which I'll ask you to answer. Will the draft local alcohol policy allow licensed premises that are part of visitor accommodation, such as a guest-only bar, to operate until 11 p.m. without being treated as the same standalone public bar? Noting that for the policy 1, the reduction in hours, that's for off licenses only. So you might want to explain the difference between those two licenses and how that first policy would be applied, considering we're talking about a visitor accommodation.
Yes, okay, yeah, well, that's right. So the policy only applies to off licenses. So accommodation where alcohol is consumed on a premises is considered an on license. So like bars and hotels and things like that are on licenses, and so the local alcohol policy wouldn't apply to those. In fact, all three policies in our local alcohol policy would not impact on licenses at all.
Thank you, Tom. Amy, can I ask you to turn your camera on? We have a question for you around the deprivation areas. Deprivation areas are determined by using New Zealand Index of Socioeconomic Deprivation. What's the radius that's applied? If there's a particular suburb such as Papanui is picked, how do you determine that it's a highly deprived area? There are areas in Papanui that have been shown as highly deprived, but there's also other areas which are quite affluent. So they're just a bit surprised to see that shopping areas of Papanui have been designated as highly deprived. Can you talk through how the mapping works?
Sure can. So the deprivation index is determined using census data from Stats NZ. So when the University of Otago are doing that, they're using the Stats NZ statistical areas. In this case, the mapping that you've seen for the LAP is based on statistical area 2, which is one of those Stats NZ geographies. And those are determined by Stats NZ, usually to make sure that each one of those geographies has about the same number of people living in them. So we don't set those boundaries or those areas, they're set by Stats NZ, and then those boundaries and the data from the census are used by the University of Otago to produce that socioeconomic deprivation index. And there's a whole range of indicators that go into informing that. So it's not just economic based, there are other bits and pieces that go in there as well.
Thank you, Amy. Do we have any other more questions out there? Feel free to put them in the chat, in the Q&A chat. I haven't seen any more there yet. I'll just double check. No. And Aviva, if you can give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down if we've got any that have come through in the email. We're just checking there, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, I'll just give you a couple more moments if there's any questions you'd like to post. So we've not had any other questions come through, so that will bring us to the end of our time together. Thank you for taking your time, this 30 or 40 or so minutes to spend with us to hear more about the local alcohol policy. If you've got any feedback about how the session was run, or if you've got more questions that you think about afterwards that you'd like us to answer, please do email it through to letstalk@ccc.govt.nz, and we can answer them. We'll include them in the copy of the questions and answers that you receive from this session today. We'll be in touch over the coming days with a copy of the recording of this webinar. It'll also be uploaded to the consultation website, which will enable you to be able to rewatch this and see the links. We'll also send through a copy of the presentation slides that we used for you today as well. We encourage you all to make a submission on the policy and to let us know if you'd like to speak to that submission to our councillors, who will be the hearings panel as a council of the whole. Submissions will close on Sunday, the 18th of May. Thank you again for your time from myself and from Tom and the rest of the team. Thanks for joining us. Ka kite anō.